IT shocks, how recent it all was. At school in country New South Wales, I knew what racism was. Of my two best friends, one was an Aboriginal and the other was a Pacific Islander. My Aboriginal friend had a hard time from our classmates and, even as a 7-year-old, I knew this discrimination was deeply rooted. I was back living in Australia in February 2008 when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued an apology to the estimated 100,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were forcibly removed from their families as children. After more than 100 years of punitive government policies, there are massive social, health and economic inequalities for Indigenous Australians and continuing trauma for descendants of the stolen generations. I remember so clearly speaking to white work colleagues about the stolen generations and the historic government apology. "I'm over it, to be honest," one said to me. The others nodded in understanding. It was, to put it mildly, gobsmacking to hear. But, other than the attitudes of my privileged young colleagues, the other element that made me gasp was learning that the policy of taking mixed-race Aboriginal children from their mothers and placing them in institutions was still ongoing in certain states in the 1970s. That's after my mother emigrated to Australia. It was incomprehensible that this sort of brutal treatment could have existed in living memory. I had a similar reaction to reading that the so-called Tinker experiment was ongoing in Scotland until the 1980s, a barbaric practice enforced so recently. Members of the travelling community were placed in specially built huts in an attempt to break their traditional lifestyle and force them to assimilate with the rest of the population, as with the motivation behind the forced removal of Aboriginal children. A few years ago I visited a Roma settlement outside Budapest where the community had been corralled to separate them from society. Despite passing legislation against such practices, Roma children are still segregated in some Hungarian schools, given less challenging classwork and taught by less qualified teachers. But that's there. Surely nothing like that would happen here? And yet, it has. It hasn't. The Scottish government has repeatedly found flimsy ways of avoiding saying sorry for these past wrongs, despite pleas from the travelling community for an apology. Our Roma population here in Scotland faces racism from the community it lives among. It is an insidious discrimination from people who don't seem to understand that their views are rooted in racism. Bizarre rumours proliferate about the Roma community in Govanhill, on the south side of Glasgow. These range from the bizarre to the criminal, and all are grossly offensive. Last summer a rumour went round the area, shared prolifically on. For more on this story, visit the news article link.